all these expectations. I remember the last time when I gave a lecture in Ghent, it was like the worst lecture I ever gave in my life. So hopefully I can do better today. Thank you, Julie, for introducing. Thank you, Godard, for half introducing. Thank you, Thomas, for inviting as well. I'm happy to see so many friends as well. I was confronted with this question, what is my work, actually a while ago. And I thought maybe it's a good beginning for a talk. I've been working already for quite some years, maybe as a professional graphic designer, 35, almost 40 years. And when you start thinking about what your work is, you sometimes don't even know where to begin, because there's so much work that I have done. And I think a lot of really bad things, a lot of insignificant things. Maybe I was lucky to have the chance to make some nice things. But it's really hard to talk about my work. I think it's also because most of my work is in collaboration. I've been working together with Armin Linke for almost more than 30 years. So when you're working with two, the idea of your work is not so easy. And then there's also what I call inevitable work, which is work that you somehow end up doing as a designer, not necessarily because it's so much something that you have wished for, but it's something that you end up doing. And then I also like to think of my work as more the things that maybe are not so much regarded as graphic design, but that I like to think about as my work, which is more casual things that I do on the side, and somehow even that are maybe a little bit overlooked. So I was also thinking maybe I can divide this talk in 3 parts. I start with early work, and then with the inevitable work, which is real hardcore graphic design, I suppose. And then we end with the nice part, at least part that I like most, which is my own stuff, kind of. So work in collaboration. I already said that I already mentioned that I worked with Armin Linke for a long time. We just split up, so it's also a bit of something that I have to get used to. Maybe that was also the question my work came up, after we really split up. But if I think about our early work, it always makes me somehow happy. And I think it's because it's so unprofessional in many ways. It's so hard to look at this work as serious work. It's so unsolved in many ways. I think, these are a few projects that I'm going to talk about now, like 3-4 books that we made in the early 90s. And at the time, what a book was very hard to it was not so clear, So there was also a good thing to it. This is the first book that I want to talk about. We made it in a project for the Jan van Eyck Academy. One of our former teachers, the Dutch designer Jan van Toorn, he had become the director of the Jan van Eyck, and he was interested in showing 3 departments: theory, design, and art. And he also was very politically engaged, and he was interested in debate. So he started quite soon on programming interesting debates with really interesting thinkers. If I think about the people who he invited at that time, it's actually quite legendary. But the subject of this book was place, position, presentation, and public. And they were actually 3 days where 3 different groups of speakers would come. And we had very little idea, like I said, of what a book should be. And in a way, we were quite opinionated at the same time. We made our own images as a kind of a beginning for this book. And then, in a way, it kind of starts with this, I think, quite uncontrolled typography. But the kind of typography is somehow also what makes this book a bit attractive. The 3 days have each a different paper color, so you can identify these as different days. And we used images from a famous work of Adrian Piper, which is called The Funk Lessons. We start with an image of the talks, and then I think what I was actually trying to say with this book too is that we only learned how to design through collage, because at the time the computer was not yet something we were able to work with. It was very expensive and no one had a computer, and we were maybe also not so interested in the technology of it. And then the only way how we experienced graphic design as students was by cutting and pasting. I think our work was like any other designer of that time. It was just copying and pasting things together. And when we looked, and we had a copy machine, so when we looked at some of these, compositions with typography, we were like, this is good. We're gonna repeat this, and we're gonna try to remake these compositions with real typesetters. So we could commission typesetters. It was part of the job. It was super expensive, but somehow our work was much more a bit. I don't know. I think like I said, we didn't know computers, but we were at the same time very much influenced by computers. We kind of liked the idea of highlighting things. So it's like aesthetically, we liked some of these, the idea of a computer, but we didn't know how to work with it. So everything else was just made by hand and really, quite fast put together. You can also say that the layouts were all made by hand, so some of them become quite a bit rough. And it all had to do with maybe also trying to look for, good layouts, simple, good layouts. But if I look at it back, and that's why I'm trying to show it, it looks as something that I would never be able to make anymore, because it's a bit out of control. It's much more looser than I would make things now. So maybe that's something to encourage students. I think you have to try to enjoy this time as much as you can, because you will do things now that you will never be able to make later. And this is actually maybe a very good thing to keep in mind. I mean, look, you can hardly take this quite serious. I think it's also because, it was Jan van Toorn was not someone who was quite afraid of working with young designers. Our first jobs were all through people that we know more or less, and we got the chance to do things as young designers. And weirdly enough, whatever we proposed was taken quite seriously. So we never felt that we had to behave in a certain way, or that the things that we were proposing were too much. So I think without having too much confidence, we were quite supported in our ideas. Okay, second book, also quite a disaster. A few years later, so it was also not that we were making books all the time. We would make maybe one book every 3 years, and then there was a big pause, and we were filling our time with, small little projects on the side, I suppose. This was a book called Riverine Architecture, and it was a book from 1994. So is that 30 years ago? Almost. This is the cover, silk screened. Again, I was describing this way of working earlier, copying and pasting things together, like literally on the copy machine, and then make it. And I think maybe that's why I would like to talk about this book. This was a book about the work of students from the architecture department in Rotterdam. And they had been on a kind of a journey on a boat along the River Rhine. And the idea was that they would think about the idea of the river in connection to cities. And so it was kind of a workshop on a boat. And when we were asked to make a publication around this, we thought it's actually, publishing was really expensive at the time. So we thought a full color book with work of students, that sounds almost too much. So we thought, maybe we should try to make this book as if we were on this boat too, that it's not too neat, that it's actually made quite quickly and quite casual, and that we're not trying to glorify this book by making it like a rich full color book. We did use the colors, but every page of this book had like one basic color. It always had an image on the bottom, underneath it. So there was always a color, an image, and some typography. There were very different parts in this book. We gave all these different parts more or less their own look or design. And if you start looking at the book, it looks quite messy, as if every page is very different. But soon you start seeing some logic in how certain contributions were designed. Like all the essays, for instance, are on yellow papers, if they were torn out of a book. Some small contributions were like small typed sheets. But there's always an image, and often these images were given by the editors, but sometimes these images were not even there. So we kind of came up with these images ourselves. And here our relationship with the computer had advanced a little bit, in the sense that we sometimes use these images in the background and we knew how to somehow treat them. So the images are printed out, and sometimes we had taken them through a Photoshop filter, and then we photocopied them again. Or we printed them out and photocopied it. So it's very much, again, in between copying and pasting, preparing something for print. So I quite like this book as a reference, because it's maybe also showing how we like to use the means that we have at our disposal. And I don't know, you get quite, I don't know, I just like this book because it's so, I think it's quite messy, but at the same time quite outspoken. Just to give you a bit of an idea of the book. And like, certainly this image was not delivered by them, but we kind of liked it, to have some sort of liveliness. I don't think I have so much more to say about this book, except that when I look at it, I'm always quite surprised. Then I get to another project which is a little bit more serious. A few years later, we got this assignment which is called the KPN agenda, and KPN was the same as the Dutch telecom and post company. It's like a huge post company in the Netherlands, and they would publish a calendar, agenda, or what do you call a day planner, once a year. And it was always quite an esteemed assignment, like for us, for designers to do. We were quite young when we got this project, and when we were thinking about these calendars that had been made in the past, we thought they always looked a little bit too much, too rich, too much over-designed, too much fancy materials. Everything looked so good. And then we thought, maybe we can take this assignment as a kind of a project to do something that we find important, or maybe that could be interesting for the people who get to see this calendar. And the size, the dimensions of this thing was always the same. It was always about this size, not very big. That was a given. And then we got the budget, which was a lot of money for us. It was like 1 million guilders at the time. And the audience was also quite big, like 100,000 people, or the edition was 100,000 people, 100,000 copies. So it was 10 euros per calendar, which is a lot of money, I think. So we came up with the idea to not just make a calendar so that people could put their notes in, but to try to make something which could be maybe kept afterwards, and maybe also something which could also speak about the nature of this company in some way. Like right away, we wanted to do something with images. And the idea how to work with images in such a format was not so difficult to think about. You see that the calendar is like it starts at, I think, 7:30 in the morning, or maybe even earlier. And then it has like, you can put no one uses this anymore, but you know how it works, something like this. And then the idea is that we would have these fold-outs, and on that side of this calendar, it would have like an image story. And it would also start at 7:30. So the image would start at 7:30, and then, other than that, what you do when you go to work, you put all your appointments there. The flip side of this book is that you have a day off. So when you are free, you do other things. So on the back side of this calendar, it said it had images of people who were just, sleeping out with their kids, who would have some orange juice, who would look at the mess that they had left the night before, which is stuff that, that the post and telecompany would actually have. And there would be, telephones, and they would read letters. And it's kind of almost that without pointing at the service that this telecom company would do, it's integrated in everyday life. So you don't have to make a special effort to show it in a fancy way. So the whole day is the whole book is like a 24-hour report of people not doing much, hanging out and having a day off. Just, and at the same time, it was also, this whole project came to be because we had read an article in the newspaper which said that photo books in the Netherlands were hardly, it was very, very hard to make a photo book and to even have it distributed. So I don't know exactly why that was, but there was also a certain type of photography that we liked at the time, which was more like the opposite of advertising in a way. It was more casual, everyday, a sort of photography that was looking at the ordinary. And this was something that we thought would be a good counterpart to this very, well, I wouldn't say commercial calendar, but somehow commercial, or was at least serving a commercial goal. So it starts, it's like 52 pages more or less with these images, and then it starts to become day again. This is a photo of an after party by Wolfgang Tillmans, and then you end up with a couple that didn't have best night perhaps. And then it ends again at 7:30. And if you would fold this back, you would actually end up with a photo book. And we thought this is a kind of a nice opportunity to show a huge amount of people some sort of form of image making, and maybe that we thought could be great. What happened, in fact, was that when this calendar was published, all the managers from this company, they were just incredibly shocked. They thought, what does this got to do with our company? So they were not very much amused. And I think most of these calendars actually ended up in the garbage, because it was something that they could not relate to. And it's also interesting because in retrospect, it was easy maybe to understand why this actually happened. Because at the time, and there was a lot of companies that went through that transformation at the time in the Netherlands. They went from, let's say, a company which was state-owned to a privatized company with a whole different set of responsibilities or aspirations. And so all the people who had just gone through, the switch from it being a state company to a private company were thinking, this is not how we like to see our company. So you could say the old ideas of asking younger designers to participate in a project like this is almost belonging to another system, to a system that completely does not exist anymore. So it was maybe also a rare moment, and maybe the last moment, that something experimental maybe like this actually happened. Anyway, I still like this very much because, when we were working on this, we were very much working on this with representatives of all these different parts of the company. And we had so many interesting discussions about certain images that were allowed by them and that were approved, and other ones that weren't approved. So our discussions were maybe the most interesting of all. And the fact that we managed to make a really interesting selection of images that are not too neat, in the end somehow was also because we fought for them, and we had a really good conversations always about it. Actually, this is a photo of Nan Goldin. It's a woman, she's crying, and they were like, we don't want to have any crying people in our agenda. And then we were just saying, yeah, but this is also maybe the reality why sometimes people needed to have a day off because something bad happened, So it's nothing. It's actually very much part of life. So anyway, so you could say it's a conceptual approach but it kind of failed because of circumstances. But I still like it. Then I don't want to really speak about this book so much, but this is more something that we made in 2005 because we had the opportunity to make something about our work. We sometimes were asked to make something, but we were actually quite young and somehow in the middle of our work at the time. But we did make a book which was based on a way of looking at our work, which we thought was something that maybe sometimes you have an idea as a designer that you think it could be very nice to take your archive, to pull everything out of your archive, put it on the floor, and actually start making new collages with it. And this is what we did for our own work. We didn't really try to explain ourselves as designers, maybe not the way I'm trying to do now. I'm trying to share with you ideas that come, when you make things, when you respond to certain projects or questions. But this is actually only about the surface of graphic design. This is a poster that we designed. Well, you have seen the book, and this is a spread also of something that I showed. Actually, we were just making new work or new images with our old work. And everything was also analog. So it was still a time maybe when everything that we thought was graphic design was a materialized object. It was a materialized sheet of paper with colors printed on it and bound, and And it was so nice to do this, also because there's no hidden meaning or no special idea. It's just that somehow we look at the surface of our work, and this surface also shows all the things that went through our hands and maybe the things that we have worked for. And then this was printed with some texts, interviews by Paul Elliman, who was a friend at the time, and he interviewed us about our clients, which was also very honest, because he's a friend who at the time maybe went through the same kind of problems with his clients. So we really spoke like how you talk in a bar about your clients. And you can probably imagine what kind of a talk that is. It's always gossiping and complaining. And, this is sort of a way how you talk to friends about your work. And this was a difficult... But what he did, he just transcribed everything literally, So even he made things even worse by adding his own experience in it. So later we were kind of happy to, to show our friends and our clients this book, but then they started reading what was in it. So it was also, they were not so happy. But, we also thought, it's okay, they know how we think about them. So, but I think at the time it was quite... a bad thing. Anyway, yeah, it's a bit like shooting yourself in the foot, and sometimes it's. I think both Armand and I have been very, let's say, not calculated in how we were perceived by people. We never tried to make ourselves better than we were. We never tried to give people an impression that was bigger than, I think it was maybe the other way around. I think we were even doing the opposite. Like I said, trying to damage our work even, or to not to be visible or to be unfound, or, Anyway, maybe that's also not a bad idea to think about when you're a student now. It's kind of nice to maybe, be invisible. Maybe that's the best position. Okay, this is the serious part of my talk, which I like I already introduced it. It's called the inevitable work, which you somehow end up doing. And there's a lot of identities and some exhibitions and maybe some publications, but it's kind of nice to find out that identities are huge projects, especially when they come into a studio of two people, and there's like a huge responsibility with an enormous amount of different types of works that is often really about how to handle all this work and how to organize that type of work. But also, when you do an identity, it looks always quite serious, but it's actually maybe one of the few moments where you're very free in how you approach a project. Because there's no one who says, I want to be this. It's more that we say, we think you should be this. What this is actually incredibly free. One of the first identities we made was for Museum Boijmans van Beuningen in Rotterdam. It's a museum which is very complete. It has starts with medieval paintings and sculptures, and it goes to contemporary art. So it has a full range of the whole spectrum of what you can find in a museum. And the collection is made by these two people. It's based on these two people whose last name starts with a B, Van Beuningen and Boijmans. And even when we got the assignment and we were in the elevator going down, this idea came up already. And so this is how, sometimes you have these things that pop in your head and it's almost too childish and you don't dare to say it out loud, but it works. It's somehow something that can be as simple and sometimes it can be as effectful. So we were just thinking the B as one line and an outline B, which together become this identity, like I already mentioned. And it could be, and so in order to really make this, we only had one example of a typeface from Lance Wyman that he had made together with other designers for the Mexico Olympics in 1968, which is a bad reference for a museum. Because it's a sport event and, how to turn something which is conceptually interesting also, how to make that formally work. And I think that was something which is, how to make it work is maybe one of the most important things. And at that time, we were, of course, looking at the typeface, and it was a beautiful typeface, but we wanted to get away from it. We also thought maybe there shouldn't be one thickness, maybe there should be different types of thicknesses. The fact that you could actually separate the inner line from the outer line was already something new. And then we asked Radim Pesco, who was a very good type designer, to specifically draw a new font for this museum in very different ways. I don't want to get too much in it, but I also don't want to show so much about these identities, but I will always try to show one of these things that I like, that we did for this museum. One of the things that I really like was always that we had these planks standing in the entrance hall, but also at different points in the museum, because the entrance hall was a newly built space by two Belgian architects, Robrecht and Damen, klopt dat? But they didn't want anything to be touched or attached to the walls, and so we only could come up with this leaning plates. But I always felt this was such a good element because all these temporary exhibitions somehow were identified with a leaning thing, and then you could just take it away and paint it over or put something new on it. This is actually one of the nice parts. I always like this device. I only have bad photos of it, but anyway. We were kicked out of the museum after 2 years, and now they still somehow use this identity, but it's brought back entirely to this Mexico Olympics, which we always thought was a bit of a bad starting point. Anyway, this is a smaller project, but also a lot of work. It's the 4th International Architecture Biennial in Rotterdam, and the whole theme of the biennial was Open City, designing coexistence. It was a very interesting subject. It was about themes that would thread the idea of the open city. And our job was to kind of organize this messy, crazy, busy project where many architects were involved with, and we started working with all the students from the Werkplaats Typografie at the time. We just had to be clever with some ideas. One thing that I like about this exhibition, and I don't know exactly why that was, but it's always held in the Nieuwe Instituut in Rotterdam, and there's a huge main exhibition space, And the architect who came up with the design for this exhibition, for some reason, he came up with a setting which was very much a setting of the office. So office tables, carpet, grey carpet as you see, and sort of these grey chairs. And we were like, hang on, it's about the open city, and why would you come up with this sort of grey default office furniture? And then we had immediately the response, maybe we should treat it as outside space. So I think this sort of immediate ideas worked out really well, to say like we just spray on it as if it's a graffiti outside. So I don't know. I like the idea that the spraying on the carpet is something that you could probably not so easily do anywhere, but it gives the space a good identity. The same is a bit with these lights that we have here. We kind of like the idea of these regular, office lights that somehow could also become signs in the city. So everything is a little bit, it's almost like office materials and office stuff that is becoming all of a sudden outside, or speaks about the outside, or speaks about the exterior rather than the interior. This is a typeface, and also that we developed with Karl Navrot. And we also use this then maybe, like we came back to this typeface many times. We used it even for a whole identity of a museum in Chicago, but it's kind of nice that some ideas start somewhere, like quite casual in one project, and they end up like they have like a whole life of their own. So it's always maybe nice that things that you have to make quick, or some things that kind of are not too overthought, all of a sudden end up maybe in another project. Anyway, this is the opening. But one of the things that ended up as another project was also this outside signage, like the sign on the building, because we just thought it would be nice to put there the word open really big. And then later, when the Nieuwe Instituut became the Nieuwe Instituut on this space, in the same space, we actually used it again, or we were asked to reapply this idea of typography, which is then new and new. So I think it's also quite nice that this idea was somehow recycled again. Okay, the temporary Stedelijk at the Stedelijk. Am I going too slow? Is it okay? Okay, I can also speed it up a bit, like... Let me know if you can also do this sometimes. Then I know that I have to be a bit quicker. I think I'm more or less halfway. He's like, okay, you can do this, huh? Okay. The temporary Stedelijk at the Stedelijk. We live in Amsterdam, and the Stedelijk was a very important place for us, and when we were students, when we became professionals, it was an important place in many ways. And at one point, and it was not only an important place for us to see interesting exhibitions, but it was also a place that had an incredibly rich history in terms of graphic design. Because, people like Willem Sandberg, who was a director of the Stedelijk, also made incredible graphic designs. Very, very... let's say, not the way we think about graphic design now. He would make graphic design when he had boring meetings. He would, design posters, and the posters were often instructions for the printer because he knew exactly the typefaces that the printer had. He knew the sizes of them. So it's a very different way of making things. He would make small publications for the Stedelijk, which were very low budget, printed at the time because it was very, very expensive to produce things, very modest materials, which was important, as a historic reference. After that came Wim Krauwel, who had like a whole different vision of graphic design, and also was able to make quite, to use the Stedelijk to show these new ideas on graphic design. He got a big critique for that at the time, but anyway, whatever happened at the Stedelijk, and especially the graphic design, was always quite... it belonged to that time, and it was a very important expression of that time. And so the Stedelijk had been wanting to have a new identity. It had set up a competition, which was a mess. We even took part in it, but I mean, I don't want to speak about this too much, but there's documentaries made about it, and they're not very much fun to look at. But if you're a student, you might want to do it. At one point, Anne Goldstein became the director of the Stedelijk. She's a curator from the US. She had been working in LA as a curator for a long time, and she was a very precise and very interesting person. She understood when she was appointed that the Stedelijk had been closed actually for a long time because it was being renovated and there was a whole new extension being built. And the people in Amsterdam were actually becoming really impatient because there was what they would call, in a very dramatic way, there were generations of students and people and their kids who had never been to the museum. So there was a lot of tension around this reopening of this place. At the time when the old building was renovated, the new part was far from ready, she said, I want to make an exhibition in that museum right now, when it's empty. And she made one of the most beautiful exhibitions at the Stedelijk, maybe the best since it opened. And this is called the Temporary Stedelijk at the Stedelijk Museum in Amsterdam. She basically wanted to show the old building being renovated. And when you were kind of looking through the building, you would think, it's kind of an empty show, there's nothing here. So all the works were incredibly subtle works. There would be pieces of polished floors, there would be beautiful like sound pieces. Everything looked quite empty and very, very invisible, very immaterial exhibition too. So she asked us to make an identity. And so we came up with this idea of the T immediately as a sort of a sign, which you can, it's a straight line and it's a vertical and it's a horizontal line and it forms a T. We even went to Karl Martin's place to roll this, with an ink roller, because we thought the gesture of rolling this is maybe even the most important thing. You mark the horizontal and the vertical space. And since it was also an exhibition which was just a temporary identity, we thought it would be nice to use up all the things that the Stedelijk still had. So they had still old stationery and old envelopes, and we just used them and printed the T over it, which was kind of a nice way of cleaning up, stacks of old stuff. And that's kind of T more or less worked on everything. We introduced kind of the basic colors that we thought belonged very much to the modernist, origin of the Stedelijk. We liked the idea of overprinting that all. In a way, it's quite an effectful and very simple identity. We didn't force it. We didn't have much time to make it. And so we also wanted, of course, to paint big T's on the windows, but then this of Marcel Broodhuis, Solowit's work was installed, so we kind of couldn't use the windows, and then we made these flags. Even the website was very, very modest and very fastly made, but everything, this gesture of the T somehow worked for its purpose. After that, actually 1 or 2 years later, this was more like a trial. She said, I liked what you did, and now I want you to make also the identity of the new Stedelijk Museum. And then it's almost like we were very happy with this project with the T. And then we were like, oh no, what do we do now? How do you make again an identity? Or how can you make a second something which is interesting again? And then we came up with this kind of, I don't know, I don't even think it's a beautiful logo, but it worked, We were kind of, how you draw and you try out things. And we thought the kind of simpleness, the simplicity of a small sign, which is an S in this case, could work. And it's almost, a little bit embarrassing to maybe propose it, but we had no better idea. And we thought maybe the sign in itself is not the most important thing, but it can work in a constellation of elements. And in our way, in our view, the S in itself was not so important, but we were more interested in the idea of these three words being somehow words that also identify a field. A bit like the T identifies a space. We thought everything what is in the museum, or what you call the museum, is something that we agree on. We agree on that this is the space that we call the museum, and that all the works that, that are here, we call them artworks. So the fact that this is, like a markation, this was more important to us. And in a way, these bits that that can be smaller and bigger, and different configurations, these strips, they became really important for elements such as the identity. You could say it's always the same typeface, and it's always placed more or less on the same height. But you could fold these as little strips around the wall, or they can become, little strips as signage. So we also try to, whenever there's an idea for typography, that this somehow needs to be carried out in everything we do. And this is a bit of a game, or like a condition for making maybe even an identity, to try to something that holds together from the smallest thing to the biggest thing. This was actually quite nicely made. Like I said, also at the beginning, we couldn't do anything like this, but we had to find people to produce interesting materials who could make everything, how to attach this even to the wall. So this was all highly specialized collaborations with people that we kind of slowly discovered, and I don't know. It was actually quite nice as well to work with all these people. You see that they come back here and there. Also, this typeface is used for posters to introduce exhibitions, for credits. We always made these huge posters which had the typeface in one type size, only capital letters, every time, new compositions, new kinds of configurations. But there's just very, very much based on rules, everything. And also in a way that if we would go, someone else could actually, based on these rules, make this. I mean, these are not even so interesting, but it's something that was set up more or less. This is a bag that was made by Klaartje Martens. She's a textile designer. She made like a really great bag, which is kind of stitched here so that, the sides are again, the bags or the sides are again emphasized. Same with the plastic bag. It looks all very simple, but it was quite a big idea to not print in the middle, but on the sides, So, and then she also made a really nice ribbon. It's actually a frame that everyone who's a volunteer in the museum could hang or use around their body in the way he or she wanted. So it's kind of a frame as a way to identify volunteers. Small things, endlessly. I don't know. I don't want to say too much about it. Just to give you a bit of an idea of, you make things for the development department, for the education department, for the restaurant. You have to make 4 books in 2 languages each. And so it's like an avalanche that you just have to handle. But even, and I think we're both a bit like this, that even when we finally have, some clear idea of what this identity is, you just try to make it work. And also in this case, I remember that we had friends from the US, old students, helping us out. But everything, these layouts were all systemized in the sense that the distances between them would help people make layouts. And I don't know, I don't think I want to go too much in the details, but it's very much about, trying to make something which can be done in a very short amount of time. I also was involved with this little book. It was a project by the education department and was actually quite bad, but I liked the idea that it was a way to look into the archives of the Stedelijk and to try to tell the history of the Stedelijk through images from the 100 years of its existence. And I very much liked to edit these and, to try to make a sort of an image story, which was also a way of making up for the lost years. Like, this is the story of the museum again, and yeah. Okay. The last project in this kind of serious part is there's a spelling mistake as well here. A collaboration with Armin Linke. Sorry. I have been working with the photographer Armin Linke since 2015. I ran into him in an opening in Rotterdam, and I think there was always an idea of doing something together, but it never really happened. It took about 5 years before we actually really did something together, and since then I haven't stopped working for him. So it's kind of interesting that I think of myself as an independent designer, but I've been working for someone over for 7 years, almost on a daily basis. So it's kind of interesting that slowly you become part of another entity. And Armin is someone who likes the idea of working as a collective. So he has like a lot of collaborators, and he's quite someone with a big capacity for setting up really large projects. I'm not even the only designer that he works with. So just to give you, but I just want to mention this because I think he's an incredibly inspiring person who's quite fearless in how he works and how he's able to include people and how to how to also make the work like a joint venture rather than I don't know how to describe it better. Where is Andrea? Hey, so actually Andrea could be able to say more about this project, but this was one of the last things that we did. It was a huge exhibition that took place in Matera, which is in the middle of the south of Italy. It's a beautiful old city where people till the 60s even lived in caves. Very beautiful. And it was capital city of Europe at the time. And so Armin was already years before asked to make an exhibition about his work in certain locations in Matera. And he always liked this, the old school, which had been abandoned for maybe 20 years, maybe longer. So it was a school that was abandoned. So this was one of the locations where I didn't even tell you that he's a photographer and a filmmaker, and who's also someone who both works for commissioned work, but also self-initiated work. So more or less his work is an ongoing practice of making images and producing them and keeping them as an archive. By the time this exhibition was made, he had 600,000 photographs in his archive, and I think all of them are actually really good photos. It's kind of something that's hard to imagine. And then there's also this enormous urge to make films. So there was one part is like an exhibition of his works in the school. And so you also see these typographical sheets in between. So there's always, every image that is in this show is also depicted on one of these sheets. And there's always like a caption with it. So everything is always double. So the work that we do as graphic designers, in this particular case, was very much trying to give Armin and his team instruments to set up this exhibition. And everything was as much a paper exhibition on printed sheets in black and white as it was like, an exhibition as a film or as photographs. And this whole exhibition, this paper exhibition, could be assembled, and you could actually, if you would want to, re-show this exhibition, you could see it in a very, very modest form. Oh, well, It's a bit complicated to explain, but this exhibition goes to from the school to the courtyard into the depot of the Museum of Ethnography or Archaeology. And so actually he was able to enter the archives and the depot of the Ethnographical Museum, and his works were somehow in dialogue with things that were there. It was actually really beautifully done because it was all covered by glass panels on which photos were hung. And then there was the very last part of the exhibition, which was office space that they emptied out with what Armin calls like the footnotes of a huge film projection that was also there. Anyway, it's quite, I mean, it's maybe not so much about the end result, but it's maybe more about how to maybe give Armin some sort of tools that work for him, that work within his interest of archiving and of, pulling things out of the archive. With the help of Andrea, we made these 2 huge, folders, which, like I said, is the whole exhibition printed out. The signage, all the captions, all the introductions, all the introduction texts in 2 languages. Crazy. But actually, so this is basically a PDF that you can print out, and then you also have something material. And you can also, as a material thing, you can remake this exhibition if you want. So it's kind of nice to try to think about how this also functions within his work. This what we did. Okay, over the last part. Casual and overlooked work. You sometimes think when you do this work that you are always working for someone else and that you always have to be ready for someone else, which is sometimes a bit of a tiring thought, you know. And so one of my casual and overlooked work is definitely teaching. It's something that I have done almost my entire professional life, but I never think about it as work. I always think about it as something that maybe makes my graphic design work interesting, because it allows me to talk about all the things in graphic design that I have no access to when speaking to a client, for instance, or while doing just regular graphic design work. All the things that interest me in graphic design end up somehow in teaching as subjects or in conversations with students. I don't know. Maybe this is a project that I can speak about at some other time, one day. And I also have some personal interests. Apart from, doing the jobs that I do, I'm also very much someone who is, probably from early on also, like you all, a consumer of graphic design and a consumer of printed matter, a consumer of images. And so I always have been interested in, looking at images and looking at what they mean, or trying to make something out of that, And so Julie was introducing me, but when Julie started, when she said that she was going to make an image, like a magazine just about images, I was like, oh, maybe I can do something for that. Or I don't even remember how this happened. But, sometimes I find an image like this, which is a fashion shoot in front of the Brandenburger Tor, which was just after the Second World War. And you can see how damaged this building is. Nevertheless, there's a photo shoot taking place just, And then maybe 1 or 2 years later, I come across this image of a woman called Ethel Gabain. And she is commissioned to draw the remains of the bombing and even the clearing out of the bombing in East London during the Second World War, which is, I think, 1941. But also the fact that she is dressed so smart. And this was probably how women were dressed anyway, at the time. But I thought, when you start thinking about this relationship of the dressing up and the kind of the beauty of being well dressed in relation to maybe places that are in ruins, or the kind of friction between those two. I always kept a folder on my desktop, which was always about, fashion and ruins. And then I also started noticing that a lot of big fashion companies started buying up ruins as if they are real estate, or like, buying the Colosseum, or owning all of a sudden the Palazzo, this Civiltà, this huge, fascist palace, which is bought by Fendi and restored by Fendi. So there's so many interesting relationships going on. So I thought maybe I can make a contribution for Julie's magazine just about this subject. And so it's just, always a little bit of a timeline. And I try to be open in the images that I choose. Maybe there always needs to be a bit of a wide range. I like the idea of printing white over them to connect them, because some of these images to me belong to one another. But it's also maybe a bit the idea of the chalk, the dust that is ending up on these images. It's just a collection of images that hopefully maybe say something about this relationship, or this ongoing relationship of the immaculate and the decay, and this endless repetition of this. Sometimes there's also an image that doesn't really belong there, but it looks good. It's, it's also kind of okay to be a little bit loose with that kind of. And the second contribution was made in a similar way. It was also something that interested me, that the oldest prints, the oldest stencils by hands were discovered in a cave in Borneo. And I was thinking, that's amazing. This is the first image of a cave, of 1,000-year-old image, And then at the same time you see body parts that are being printed, or And then I was like, of course, maybe this is one of the most important images. It's always fascinated me, this image of Man Ray, where Merit Oppenheim, who's a really great artist herself, is standing there with the printing press with a hand full with ink. And you're like, what does this image mean? Is she ready to make a stencil with her hand? Or is she... and this is this mechanized idea of printing. How does that relate? It's a kind of a puzzle that cannot be solved. And then there's also some really complicated images of this British photographer called Terry Richardson, who is making images for a Pirelli calendar. But I think the female body and how it's being used by themselves or by others as printed objects is also a sort of an ongoing narrative in that has ever since the beginning of photography more or less appeared. So I liked again to make this collection of women in printing situations. And then I kind of went to the darkroom and made these photograms with my hand. It was also a bit of an old-fashioned way of, but I liked the gesture of this. I don't think I'm so. It's such an important thing for me to do, but I very much. I feel like I'm a beginner when I'm making these kind of contributions, but I really enjoy the work. I also made a contribution about women and printed clothes, or let's say newsprint on clothes. This was for a contribution for a book by the Experimental Jet Set, a graphic design collective in the Netherlands, who made a publication around the idea of kiosks in public space. And they asked several people to make footnotes for this text. And when I was reading this text, I noticed that there was not one woman mentioned in the whole of history of these kiosks in the street. And then I was thinking, this is so hard to believe. There's so many women who carry around the news and who behave as kiosks, or you could even look at them, as a kiosk. So this is just a study in women on the street serving news or bringing the news or being depicted as a female character within a news setting. I don't know. I just thought it's kind of a good way to counterbalance maybe what is lacking a little bit in there. Okay, and then there's the last project I want to talk about. It's really the last one. And I made a book for a friend called Nigel Shafran. He's a British photographer. And the book is called The Well. And it shows his commercial work. Nigel Shafran is actually quite a good photographer, and he likes his work to be known for his modest photos, which are very much photos of his domestic life, his girlfriend on the phone, his kid, the dishes that they do, and all of these photos are really they're quite outspoken and very modest and very beautiful. But at the same time, he sometimes works as a commissioned photographer, weirdly enough, as a fashion photographer. And he kind of likes this to be somehow a secret. He just doesn't like the idea of him being known as a fashion photographer. And I was working on a publication with him, and I remember that he came with a photo shoot that he had just done, and I was looking at these images, and I was like, wow, your fashion images are amazing. And he was like, no. And I said, I want to make a book about your fashion work. And he was like, over my dead body. Because I don't want to be known for my work as a fashion photographer. And it took me like 3 years to convince him to try to really make this book. And I don't think it was that easy to convince him in the end, because what actually made this book nice and interesting is that all his life, from the very beginning when he started walking around with a camera, he had been making photos of people who were shopping, of shops, of shopping windows. So he's not someone who hasn't been looking at the act of shopping. You could say that his fashion photos, his commissioned work, is actually only part of that whole change of how the high end of fashion ends up in magazines. But in the end, it ends up like a poor image of, a sale somewhere in the streets of London, and it says everything must go. So I think I was able to convince him of the fact that the book should not be just the beautiful pictures that he makes, but it should be his view in the entire spectrum of him looking at consumption. So the book is a kind of a combination of, some photos that he made, like I said, everything must go. But it also shows, because it's also 30 years of his work, it really shows how the act of shopping and the places of shopping has changed. So it became a really interesting document. And also his role has changed in this. So this is how he started out when he was a super young kid. He just, he was living in England, and there were these new magazines that started to appear, like Idea and The Face. And these magazines would not just look at high-end fashion, but they would look at streetwear. Or he would just go with a friend who was a stylist with a bag full with fake Louis Vuitton things, and they would just photograph people that they liked on bicycles or in the laundrette to just, it was like really impulsive and very casually made. I think this was made in the early 80s. But it could have been made yesterday, Anyway, fake Louis Vuitton still exist. This was also interesting. He was at one point, is that Belfast? And at the time it also had these conflicts between the Protestant and the Catholic. So there was every now and then also bombings. And when he happened to be there, they were all putting new windows in because all the bombing had just, damaged all the shopping windows. So I kind of like that these small stories, inserts, also happen to be in that book. Then he made these stories where he and a friend would want to try to make a story about science fiction and urban science fiction, and they would just every day they went out and shot new images. So it was also a way of not being even commissioned as a fashion photographer at the time, at the very early beginning, but just working as a fashion photographer. And it was not so professionalized, you know. It was just everyone could just submit their contribution, and sometimes you were published and sometimes you weren't. So it was also, no one had anything to lose, you know, in the 80s. No one had any money. It was just you had energy, and you started working, and then you would just produce work. Same with this friend that they just who was actually quite a well-known model. But she and him just had some bunch of T-shirts and went out to shoot this. Anyway, all I want to say is that 30 years of work and slow change of how commerce and fashion and the idea of fashion and how it's being portrayed somehow ends up in this book. This was probably in the early 90s somewhere. This is a famous series that he had made, which none of these people are professionals, but these are kids hanging around in a shopping center, and he just photographs them. But they could have been a fashion photo, or they are maybe fashionable because they look cool, and it's maybe more youth that we find interesting than fashion to begin with. And then for a while, he also made some portraits of quite iconic figures. Also, for instance, many of the photos that are in this book were not really published, because at the time he was photographing this person called Faith Evans, and all these people were standing around her and they wanted to be photographed with him. So he said, okay, with her, I mean. So he just made this picture but never really thought about it. But in retrospect, these become interesting photos. Also, Linda Evangelista was a fashion model, famous model, with her school friends in Canada. I don't know. Everything what Nigel does makes it actually quite ordinary, or he tries to also maybe undo fashion a bit. Young girls being scouted. This was the story that I really liked at the time when I started first thinking about this book, is that he had been going to Avenue Montaigne, which is the fancy street in Paris where all the big shops are. And his idea was that young women would perform the act of shopping in the store. So, you know, the bag, transaction, writing out the check. So I thought this is such a great idea for a fashion shoot. And it's also, in a way, documentary, but it's staged. So I think there's a lot of really great ideas. And then Nigel slowly became the photographer who started working, made his way back into high-end fashion and started working for Vogue US. And then he made the most crazy, I would say, quite extreme photos in that context. I really like this photo. But again, you know, one of his shoots, he didn't make anything new for this book, only the very few last pictures. This is also typical Nigel. He's in Paris and he sees these workers, you know, taking a little break, but he copies this exactly then with people dressed in, what was it again? Probably Celine or, anyway. And this is Nigel doing a photo shoot with Gigi Hadid. But I think he also creates awareness, or that we understand what we're looking at. And the models are never really shown as a sexual object, but they're shown as young women who have energy and they are alive and they're playing in his little game, you know. So they become much more actors in the sets that he creates. And I think this is a very different way of making, maybe approaching fashion photography. Even silly photos like this, you know. And this is one of my favorite photos. It's Bella Hadid dressed up as a as a gas pump. And if you're talking about fashion, this bag that she's wearing here is probably cost maybe 3,000 euros or something, or $3,000. But it's just, yeah, it's a funny thing that he had made when he went to a dress-up party. But I think that he's able to kind of insert these types of images in these fashion magazines. I think is quite extraordinary. To me, they all, they're really also sort of a critique about shopping and about fashion. So that's why I thought it was so good to try to make this book. This is the only shooting, the only images that he made specially for the book, where he asked young girls to actually pose, or to imitate the pose of something which is, apparently in the street. And this is the credits, which of course need to be done. And then, of course, we had a long talk about how to make a cover. And in the end, it was just, this is it. This is actually, he made this cover in the 80s for a French magazine that doesn't exist anymore. But I like the idea of spraying everything away so that it's only, you kind of get rid of the context, but you only see the image. And that's a bit the idea of the book. That's it. Thank you very much. That was a warm applause. Yeah. Was it long? Was it okay?
Really okay.
Okay. Not too slow, not too.
Would you like...
If you have questions, yeah, fine.
Maybe I will start.
Ah, you have a question?
I was wondering if I see the last book you showed.
Yeah.
Very clear, you have a specific idea what you want to do and what you want to make. But then if I look through to some other projects, it's not only a very strong idea, but it's also a bit of a very political idea, I would say, or a very strong opinion that you have on certain things, like in the KPN agenda that you want to show this leisure.
A day off.
The day off, yeah,
in relation to the work, yeah.
The gossiping that you show, so
yeah.
Like there is a very strong sense of agency. I was wondering if you can maybe say something about you as a political person and a graphic designer, or something like this.
I don't know. I mean, I don't even see myself so much as a political person. But maybe every project in a way starts with trying to see the project, like what the hell is going on here? What is actually being asked of us? Or how does this object function? What does it exist? And is it something that I want to participate in? And often the answer is no. I'm always thinking, this is horrible, I don't want to make this day planner or this calendar. I mean, I was thinking this is an uninteresting assignment, or it's really not an interesting question. And as soon as you have that as a kind of, let's say, a conclusion, you can ask yourself, but then what does make it interesting, or where is the potential within this assignment? And maybe the one way to kind of keep working as a designer is to somehow create your own problem within the assignment that you get. Like, what do I want to do for this project? And if you can think, I would like to make a photo book, as a calendar, so that people actually maybe see different images, or maybe there's a certain type of image that is so unlikely of the commercial images that normally, are produced by the company, but just so that you see how this work, but the KPN agenda ends up in regular households, and which is much more interesting for me, if you think about it as advertising, than creating, fake worlds. So I don't think it's necessarily so political, but it's maybe just hoping that you can open up a space a bit to something else. And maybe it also has to do with how we grew up, as designers, or how we also went to art school, like you are here. And in a way, graphic design at the time, I think, when we were taught graphic design, it was also, not necessarily being neat and behaving like you're supposed to. It was okay to ask questions or to look for space, and it becomes more difficult, to find spaces and to see the spaces. But as long as that's possible, I like to do graphic design. And I even think it's a more interesting platform than maybe being an artist, because I also think it was always the struggle: do I want to become an artist or an applied artist? And I think maybe it's more difficult to be an applied artist, and maybe it's also kind of interesting, like to look at people like Nigel, who is also an applied artist, but really finds space on these gigantic platforms that fashion magazines are, to say other things about women than what you normally see. So I just think if you look hard, or if you keep looking, I think there's space for things. And maybe people don't fully understand, or don't understand the scope. Maybe we don't even fully understand, or I don't. But you hope that maybe you can do something which is worth doing. And I don't know if it's political. Maybe it's critical, maybe it's playful, maybe it's trying to escape the obvious. All of these things could also be maybe keywords. It's nice to call it political because it sounds good, but maybe it's a bit too much to call it political, I think.
Anyone else?
Has your work ever come back to you? For example, to barge into a room and find out that your calendar was hanging up?
What? That the calendar was what?
That your calendar was hanging up inside the house, or maybe some artist was scribbled a bit on one of your designs and eventually made a nice story?
Not so much, because usually these things, they don't have such a long life. I mean, some publications do, but the way you describe it now, I think to find one of these day calendars now, and there was, like I said, 100,000 were made. I don't think you can find one of them anymore. I think they're all gone, So sometimes, no, I don't think so. It's ephemeral. It's stuff that has a certain time, lifespan, and then the message is old. So maybe books, but even the books that we made, I don't think they have such a long life. I mean, the more experimental they are, the more harder it is for them to last. I think I sometimes go to the Slechte, or do you have this here? And then I'm like, oh no. You see it always in some of your works, you find it in the Slechte, and you're a bit like, oh, that was a bad book. I wish it would vanish from the surface of the earth. But there's also the other way. I think it's more the other way around. When you think about how I started this lecture, what is my work? I like to pick out the examples that excite me, and that then people think oh, that's cool and interesting. But there's so many works that we made that are really, not so great, or I'm kind of ashamed about them maybe, or they're not so successful, or we didn't know how to handle forms, or they're clumsy and they look bad nowadays. So it's maybe more the other way around, that I see a lot of bad things, which I'd rather not. Bruno.
Because you said it kind of now also quite kind of openly that you like look back and then like some things and you don't like some things, but do you notice this while you're doing them, or do you love everything while you're doing it, or kind of do you already know? Do you like while you're doing it? Do you already like suspect you might not like this, or kind of?
Well, you know, when I made this cover, I thought this is gonna be a good cover. It took me a long time to make it, but it's like, this is going to be a good cover. I'm not worried about it. And I think I'm gonna like this cover in 10 years or 50 years time too. But I think what is maybe sometimes disappointing is that, and this is maybe something which is harder to identify, but I think we're often, or maybe me, I'm sometimes really in the moment thinking about maybe a certain form of graphic design that is maybe hip or trendy, and then I can't, you know, then I think I want to be part of that, or I want to use this. And I think always in retrospect those turn out to be the bad decisions, you know. And then you're so excited at the moment that you are in tune with your time, and that you think like, it's also maybe saying I understand what is going on at the moment. But then later, those are the weak projects. In a way, I found out that all the projects that still hold up are somehow harder to grasp, or they are, like I said, the very early ones, because they're clumsy and they don't compare to anything so much. But I think there's certain, I don't know, a bit of a distance works better, weirdly enough. A bit of a cooler approach. I have experienced that. And I mean, we made like we did everything. We never said no to anything. So we made flyers for parties, we made invitations for bad galleries. I mean, we made covers for magazines that are not so important. And then maybe you can say, of all the magazines covers that we made, maybe 1 or 2 are nice. And we made posters for dance companies, and maybe of all the posters that we made, maybe 3 posters I can say are good. And we have to make 20 posters to make 3 good posters. So it's not that we only make good work. It's completely the opposite, to be honest.
Yeah, I have a question. How do you deal with the gray zone of on the one hand using images that are not your own, which you manipulate in a way to make your own, versus using images which you put into a context so they become like this kind of story or a narration? I'm especially asking it in relation to like student work as well, because it's a thing, like we consume images so much.
Yeah.
We're also drawn to them, and somehow maybe we also want to use them or consume them or reproduce them. Mm-hmm. Especially if you're doing some editorial design, mm-hmm. and you wanna like, you don't have the capacity to take pictures, for instance, in the same way like how you want to use some pictures. Like, I think it's sometimes like a difficult.
But are you talking about copyrights?
Yeah.
Or are you talking more about why make new images if you can use already existing images?
No, because I think I don't really question like why make new images, but more like how do you deal with copyrights and the archive and.
I don't deal with it. I completely ignore the subject.
Yeah, but then
I mean, Will once told me, "Why are you bothering about these images? Because they won't. If you're talking about printed matter, they're hardly ever traced back. I think images are easily traced back, maybe when you use them online. Mm-hmm. But if you print them, the small editions, and they're quite obscure sources often. Mm-hmm. They're also translated. They're not so big used. And then when Will once said, I wouldn't worry about it. I never worried about it anymore. You know? And then I was thinking, I was like, that's cool, Will. Thank you for liberating me from that problem. And then the other thing is, I'm chicken. So I'm always thinking, it's not me who blames. It's the printer, or not the printer. It's the publisher who takes the responsibility. So yeah, and like I said, I'm really, and like if the publisher says, I can handle it, or Roger, Roma often says, I'm fine with it. He's never really, so he's I think from experience, there hasn't occurred these type of things, never actually. So maybe lucky until now. I mean, I once used an image of a British painter. She made these beautiful optical paintings, and this was in a tiny little magazine, like a little. And her estate had seen this, and luckily the magazine that we made was called Blind, and so he said it's for the blind, and and it's really we got away with this, and like okay, fair. But I think it's the but I think I understand the problem, but I like to ignore it. So far so good.
Yeah.
So maybe this talk should not be online.
Yeah, knock on wood.
Linda. If no one else will.
Uh-oh.
No,
It's a long
I
jump.
don't even know if it's a question, but it's been really good to see this, and it's also really good to see how you've edited your own work, categorized these things. You have different position in relation to certain works, and it's beautiful to be reminded that you talk about Anne Goldstein as the person that you were working with, as in the same way as Nigel was the person that you were working with.
Mm-hmm.
And it's also beautiful to, I mean, it's great to finally see more of this, because I've seen the ring binders with Andrea, but I've never seen images of the work he did with Armin Linke.
This is only a tiny amount of work.
Yeah, right?
Mm-hmm.
And there's that ongoing, that feels like it's a result of a long ongoing process and friendship with Armin, of course.
Mm-hmm.
And it was really nice to see that this sheet that you and Arman had made for the Stedelijk of these positions, these different positions that are possible with these three words and how you organize them on the page.
There's actually a few more sheets, also
Okay.
with the colors and also with the dimensions of the things that we had to make. So it's actually only like, only a fraction of, let's say, how this identity was carried out over several other things. There's much more to it in a way.
But a lot of those things are conceived like in very casual, I mean, you say it yourself, oh, we knew it within 3 seconds in the lift going down. And I know of you that your work looks extremely casual, and it's not. And I just wonder what the difference is between handing a work or producing a tool for other people to work with, like Armin, and the Stedelijk Museum or the Boymans from Birmingham, and how, like Shili says, it's like, what would Linda, I mean, Armin is probably sitting there using this tool or his assistant, so he's also thinking, what would Linda do? What would Linda do?
I'm not so sure.
Because he's probably having that conversation with you in his head. And that's not also absolutely an editorial conversation. It's not just a formal. I think Shili pointed it out, that you're an incredible editor as well. I think you downplay that here, but I'm not sure. I'm just wondering about how you hand tools over for other people to use when they're definitely idiosyncratic and they're derived from an understanding of print technologies, and that you have to start from scratch with these grids and structures that you want other people to use, as opposed to Instagram or an existing structure that you just throw content in. It's not, I don't know if it's a question, it's just like, how do you, what's your experience with Armin and their use of your tools as opposed to the Stedelijk Museum and their use of your tools, and how
And not
much
so much there's not such a big difference, not at all. No, I think it's also maybe always trying to think ahead. Like maybe if I would want to make my own things, you sometimes say like, oh, I don't need any rules. I can do whatever I want. But the nature of these type of assignments, like whether they identities or whether working with huge archives or multiple images that end up in one thing, it only works when you start applying rules. And I think many of the identities that we have done is always like, how can the identity survive? Because you never know whether you're going to be the person who will execute this, or whether you will be participating in this. And so every identity that we have made somehow became something as an experience for the next one, you know. So the first one with Boymans, we were just kicked out after 2 years. We hardly even had the possibility to work with the identity. But we knew that the typeface was strong and could, you know, have a longer life. It was kind of molested, but that's okay. You know, and when we were working for the Stedelijk, we were actually thinking, this is the opposite. We are not going to be kicked out because we love to work with Anne Goldstein, and it's so nice to be able to think about an identity which has rules and starting points, but it also has enough space for us to play with it, you know. So, and then we really thought this is nice because we don't want to hammer it entirely down, but we will be able to develop it in a kind of a loose way. And that failed because we weren't kicked out immediately, but Anne, you know, stopped working for the Stedelijk quite soon. And then we went on to make an exhibition of an identity for the Museum of Contemporary Art in Chicago. And then we knew, for instance, that we were not going to work with the identity. So it's also like, how can an identity then be made without us, you know? So then we decided to make a very strong typeface. So it's always trying to be strategic in what is the best way for this specific setup. And I was always shocked that identities have a very brief life nowadays, because I was thinking it needs to be at least there for 5 to 10 years, because then, you know, you don't have to do so much. But now you almost have to make it work from day one, so that it's stable for maybe 1, 2 years, 3 years, I don't know. But we always came up with new strategies according to the nature of how we imagined it to work. But yeah, I don't think we made ever a successful identity in that sense. They are fragile. They're very, you have to be a little bit lucky. But with Armin it's kind of nice, you know. I started using a lot the Union, which was the font that we used for the Stedelijk, because I thought, if I can't use it for the Stedelijk, I'm gonna use it for Armin. It's my project, you know. And I don't know. Does that help a bit, or is that proper? No, maybe not. Tiny. Besides the point answer.
Yes, I really liked what you said about that, like, you don't try to give an impression, like, to be better than you actually are.
Yes,
when you approach these
that's really true.
And yeah, I was curious if, like, this is something that was always kind of in you, or is that something you learned?
No, I think, you know, I think both Armand and I come from a very modest background, and I think we're the product of social democracy in the 60s, 70s, 80s in the Netherlands. We were really the product of, you know, good education. We could go to school. We had good libraries that started to pop up. We had access to things that our parents never had access to. So we just ended up going to art school, which is unheard of, you know, for people from. I come from farmers' families, you know, not so far from here. So like art school was like out of reach for anyone. So I think we never learned how to behave, even. You know, we have no idea of how to stand proudly next to our work or how to own our work. I think we mostly feel that we try to do a good job for the projects that we've been asked for, and we try to take responsibility for them, but not without any, let's say, not in a lame way, you know. We want to do them in an interesting way. So there is a certain confidence in how we want to treat these projects, but it's not that we want to stand beside them and look, I did that. I think this is this feels bad, or we don't know how to do it. We don't know how to sell our work. We don't have a website. We don't even publish, you know. Even when we publish this one book, it's actually more something that we'd like to do rather than giving any information that would help us. Because I think a lot of the stories that maybe drive our work is interesting. That's why I sometimes do a talk, because I think, okay, you know, I shouldn't just be entirely silent about what we do, because it might be good for others to know or to. But yeah, does that answer your question?
Yeah.
Maybe it's also a little bit something Vlaams, or what is that? You know what I mean? Very modest, or maybe a bit not too much bravoure, or you know what I mean? You know, it's very Dutch to be the opposite, to be like, hello, you see me, but I think maybe we both come from the south, and it's maybe also small village mentality.
Yeah, it's also a way to leave all the pressure of
To ignore it.
that you could put on yourself, yeah, and like to create a free space to actually design and like be in the moment with the stuff you have.
But I also think
I
it's
see
just
it as something really positive.
But maybe it's also. I mean, I don't necessarily always think as something entirely positive. It sounds. I don't want to sound it like false modesty, but I sometimes also think. I know that I have a position, and maybe I should stand out more, you know, and stand up for certain things, and be more, voice myself, because it might be important. But I don't take place in that arena of discussions, or, you know. So I always think that maybe people who are properly educated and know that when they have an education, they also take on this position and try to say. Maybe their ideas when it's important, you know. So or they publish, but yeah. No, I think I could and I should, but it's just. I think it also has to do with priority, maybe, or being too busy or exhausted by the everyday. You know, it's hard to try to make space for that. But maybe I should.
Maybe it's an idea to drink in KASKlezing, because they.
A drink, that was so nice now.
Because they stayed open, so I think let's go there and continue the discussion, but not before we put our hands together one more time.
Oh.